a few questions. Some really good ones have come through,
Great.
and one concerns Jackson's reputation, which isn't very good, right? His poll ratings are way down among historians and the general public. And the question is whether, that aside, and most of that has to do with his views on race, as you suggested, and Indian removal. Um, how would you rate him just in terms of his impact as an impactful
Oh,
president and his impact on the United States?
uh, huge. He there. I mean, I think as I said, his military operations alone are crucially important for establishing the United States sovereignty over the Gulf South, and in competition with European empires, as well as quote unquote extinguishing the sovereignty of Native American groups. But as a president, he became not just a symbol, but an important partisan actor in creating a political coalition with his eventual vice president, Martin Van Buren, that wielded power for much of the antebellum period. And so, I guess what I'd say is we do need to remember that Jackson was someone who a lot of white men in America looked up to. I mean, this was a guy who you wanted to be like, despite all of what we see as his flaws. For white American men at the time, this was a symbol of masculinity, of political rights and authority, power. People, white men were enraptured by that. So, I mean,
Yeah.
certainly one of the most important figures in our nation's history, no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Just real quick, I got to share some love you're getting on the chat, that your presentation style is beautiful, fast and furious, that it's phenomenal, your structure,
Good.
and
Oh, I'm glad.
yeah, so you're hitting it out of the park. And another question came in about Jackson's post presidency, and this is something we don't really talk about very much as historians, and
Yeah.
I don't know if it's something that you think about much, but what happens to him, when he rides off into the sunset?
Great question. He certainly remains influential as a power broker within the Democratic Party from his estate, the Hermitage in Tennessee. He certainly is someone who politicians from Van Buren to the man who takes on the label Young Hickory to kind of mirror Jackson's image as Old Hickory. James Polk, as an expansionist a Democrat of the 1840s, produces the circumstances in which, like in Jackson's time, the United States territorial sovereignty moves not only into Texas, but through a war with Mexico, takes much of what is now the southwestern United States. So that kind of Jackson's example as a territorial aggrandizer certainly rubs off on the Democrats who follow him. I think that's
Yeah.
maybe his legacy is mostly in that, is inspiring what by the 1840s and 1850s was called Young America. This kind of rapidly, the believers in manifest destiny, that it's Americans' God-given right not only to take North America, but gosh, let's not stop there. Let's go to Central and South America and the Caribbean too. We'll take it all. That's,
Yeah.
you can see kind of the origins of that and what Jackson accomplished during the War of 1812 and in its aftermath.
Yeah, no, that's great. So from Old Hickory to Young Hickory.
Yeah, yeah.
He was a power broker.
Hmm.
Okay, one last question, then we're going to get to our discussion of
Okay.
terrific documents. So the question is about the connections between the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement, or the early suffrage movement. And how would
Good.
you describe that relationship? How did that work?
That's a great question, and I think what scholars have shown is that people like Angelina Grimke, um, and many other women involved in the abolitionist movement came to think about women's rights through their efforts to emancipate enslaved Americans. So they came to see the limits to their own ability to enjoy citizenship through their work for enslaved people. Now, I think there's probably some disagreement even among the most radical abolitionists about the extent to which they wanted to do away with all of those limits. So the radical document that comes out of Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, where abolitionists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, are the dominant forces, where they're saying that marriage is akin to slavery. Not all American women, even of this radical political persuasion, would agree with that. But certainly, the parts of that document which focus on the unequal education of women, and therefore having the professions, work as a lawyer, as a doctor, kind of prohibited to them, is something that these women shared, and it came out of their efforts in the abolitionist movement. So I think these movements for rights are connected to each other, but there's certainly opposition. The vast majority of white American men, in particular, are going to be opposed to both of these radical movements, and you can see that. But both of those things, oppositions to women's rights and to abolition itself, are reflected in the burning of Pennsylvania Hall.
Yeah, that's such a powerful story, and you described that really well. And we had a really smart
Thanks.
comment come through the chat that both abolitionists and early women's rights activists are inspired by movements in England. So
Sure.
it's just like how you described this transatlantic economy, that's interesting. There's kind of a transatlantic economy of ideas and reform happening at the same time, which is really interesting.
Of course, there's so much that I wanted to talk about.